So sitting back and just relaxing where you are. And let's start, as we often do. Take a couple of deep breaths. Slow, long. And letting the breath go down into the belly. And after the two deep breaths, just breathe naturally, letting your breath flow. Just as it usually does. And paying attention to it. And it helps focus the attention. If you close your eyes and just experience this breath as it flows in and flows out. And particularly the touch sensation of the breath as it comes in through the nasal passage and goes out through the nasal passage. Just in that one spot is enough to become mindful of the experience of this very breath. And if the sound of the siren also has penetrated and come into your attention, that's fine. Letting it come, and it is going. And back on the breath. Noticing the quality of this breath. Is it long or short? Is it smooth? Ragged? Not trying to make the breath conform to any idea of what it should be. Just let it be what it is. And we're noticing. We're being mindful. No judgment. When thoughts arise, and they probably will, it's not a problem. Just letting them arise and pass. That's just what thoughts do. Staying with the breath and not getting caught up in the content of the thought. Or returning to the breath. Our attention is like a spotlight. It focuses on something, and it's also it illuminated it. It brings it into our awareness. What are you noticing about this breath, about how it feels? The flow of the air in the nose and the nasal passage. Maybe noticing the difference in the temperature. Maybe cooler as it draws in and warmer as you exhale. And now I invite you to move the spotlight of your attention back away from the breath, taking the backward step, as Zen Master Dogen calls it, backward away from the breath, and instead turn the spotlight of your attention around so that the focus is on you, on yourself. With the inquiry, who is it? Who is this me? Focusing the spotlight of your attention onto yourself. Who is this me? And of course, the first response is, it's the me I carry around all the time. It's the me I identify with, the me that makes me me. It's all my experience, my strengths, my weaknesses, and all of my conditioning. Everything I've experienced and how it's impacted me. And all of us here have practiced mindfulness. Some of us are new to mindfulness, and some are longtime practitioners. And if you're fairly new at mindfulness, you may identify this me as someone with a sense of powerlessness, relative powerlessness, maybe someone who has been a victim during your life, someone who's always asking, why me? Why has this happened to me like this? Someone who carries life as a heavy burden. Someone who has faced many challenges. And there are others of us who also have faced heavy challenges, and many of them, but who have practiced mindfulness for long enough to realize that our conditioning, that what we identify as me is not engraved in stone. As mindfulness practitioners, we become more and more aware that we can make changes mindfully. We can make new decisions, fresh decisions, tasting the freshness of life in new ways. And wherever and whoever you identify with as this me, as this self, I'm going to invite us now, all of us, to move on beyond this familiar sense of self with all its history. And focusing more clearly the spotlight of our attention on this me. A meditative journey past our usual sense of self, just for now. I'm going to invite you to do this by guiding you in a meditation in which we're going to imagine that our senses are removed. And by senses, I mean the seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. We'll go through one by one. So invite you to imagine that your sense of sight has been removed. And it might be fairly easy since you have closed eyes right now, that you cannot see. You cannot see, and yet you're still there, just that the sense of sight has been removed. But that which makes you, you, is still present. And now the same imagination with regard to hearing. Imagine also not only your sense of sight, but also your hearing is removed. And yet you're still present. And again, right now, it's a work of imagination, but it has a deep point. Smelling. Imagining that no longer are you able to smell. But this you is still present. This sense of self is still there. And doing the same with tasting and touching, these senses being removed from you. And yet there's another sense, as the Buddha pointed out, and that is the sense of the mind thinking. Imagining that you are no longer able to think. Thoughts don't come up, and that takes some imagining. No thinking, planning, and emotions also are removed. With all these senses removed, yet you are still present. What is it that is present? If all the faculties of sense were removed, what still remains? Because you do still remain. What is it? And if you found this exercise in imagining the removal of your senses kind of a stretch and hard to do, then I invite you instead to just imagine that you are a newborn baby who has not yet connected with any of its senses. It doesn't know any of its senses. It's still present. You haven't gotten in touch yet. So now when all the senses are removed, when you're a newborn baby, what remains? What is it that's present? Moving into this very simple place, a place that exists before everything else, and a place that isn't even a place, but it's never missing. This is you. This is yourself, your fundamental self. And touching into it is the simplest thing in the world. When we relax, all that activity, creating a self, what our eyes present to us, and our ears, and our thoughts, and our smelling, our sense of taste and touch. When all that's gone, this is still there. So can we realize that when we take a backward step with our attention and turn the spotlight of our attention onto yourself, there's this place of utter familiarity, the closest thing to you that you've known ever since you were born, but seldom touch into. Can you touch into it now? If we want to give it a name, it's called pure awareness. Awareness without all the input of our sense organs. Can we realize that if this pure awareness is true for you yourself, then it's true for the world as well. It's not something particular to yourself or even to human beings in general. Is the world any different? Can we realize that our senses create the image of forms that we see and hear and taste and smell and touch and think about. All those objects, internal and external, created by our senses, including thinking. Can you recognize that pure awareness has no object? There's no form there. No objective content. Just pure being. Just your fundamental nature. So I invite you now for the rest of this meditation to go back, if you wish, to mindfulness. Mindfulness of the breath, letting that be the object of your attention. Or mindfulness of the body, letting that be the object. And for the next few minutes, coming back time and again and touching in, turning the spotlight of your attention onto yourself and resting in pure awareness, back and forth between mindfulness with an object of your attention and then resting in your fundamental nature. So I'd like to make a couple of comments about this meditation. I think inviting you to remove various sense faculties can be a pretty tedious and maybe not too successful effort. It's so much easier just to say, trying to imagine that you are a newborn. You don't have to go through all that stuff. But there is a point to that, an important point, and that is for us to begin to really understand that the world of form that we see and sense through the other organs is actually a result of our perception, and that fundamental reality exists, I don't want to say separately, but prior to, and that the form that we see is in fact an expression of the fundamental reality, but it is not primary. We're going to be talking more about this, maybe in this talk coming up, in terms of new scientific evidence. But I'm bringing it up here to say that I didn't just suggest it because this is a really kind of a difficult exercise to remove the various senses. It's an introduction to something really, and maybe you know it already. I know that some of you do, but the senses are an expression. There's something primary prior to it, preceding it, more fundamental, and they are an expression of it. So we, as our sense of self, we're individualized, are localized expressions of what's fundamental in this world, which is pure awareness. Not just me or you or human beings, but throughout the world, it's awareness, R, same word, are used here synonymously, consciousness. It is the fundamental reality. And this was an effort, this meditation, to help you begin to get a glimpse of, boy, if you take those away, the various senses and the input from the senses, something still remains. And inviting you to get in touch with the something that still remains. So having said that, also, I thought I'd point out, I hope that, this is a tremendously powerful exercise, or I don't even want to call it practice, it goes so far beyond practice, to do during the day easily. And I've said this, I think I'll probably say for the rest of the time, however long I'm here at IMCC, do it during the day, many times during the day. You don't have to go through this rigmarole of reducing and removing senses. Just touch in. Some of you are able to do it just like that. And others, maybe it is a matter of trying to imagine that you are a newborn who hasn't yet gotten in touch with the senses. Any way that you can do it, do it. Just rest in what you've always known, but we're so busy because our minds and our senses do what all they're doing. They do wonderful stuff, our minds and senses. We can't be without them, right? But there's something there in addition, prior to and more fundamental. So those are my comments on our meditation. So in my talk a couple of weeks ago, I spoke about the contemplative path, and I did that from an experiential point of view. We discussed the experience. What is the experience that we've had? And we had a conversation afterwards in which, a beautiful conversation, actually. We were invited you, and many people spoke up and shared. And as somebody commented, we're saying things here that we don't usually say to other people. It was just such trust, and it was a really beautiful conversation. So tonight, I'm going to continue talking about the contemplative path, but now from a very different point of view, because there is new scientific information, new in the last years, that is out that validates what contemplatives have known to be true for all along. And that is that there is something bigger than us in this universe. Call it God, or the divine mystery, our spirit, or whatever we want to call it, consciousness, pure awareness. There is this has been validated. And so this is what I want to talk about tonight. And then again, we're going to have a conversation afterwards. I hope many of you will speak up because I'm going to talk about these research results. And they're in words, by the way, that all of us can understand, which means a lot because I'm certainly not a scientist, really understandable. And I hope that you will speak up because finally, all of this is about you, right? It's not just talk, but it's about you and your path in life. So I hope that we'll all share with each other. So just a little bit of background, as we all know, when the Enlightenment in the late 17th century occurred in Europe, this was the beginning of what grew to be a real animosity between religion on the one hand and spirituality, or science on the other. And we all know the trajectory of that in the 20th century, and that is that science won, right? I don't mean religion didn't evaporate, but science was definitely, it won. Science determines what's real, what's true. That's generally accepted in cultures. We may not accept it, but that's generally the cultural assumption that if science says it's so, that's it. If science doesn't say it's so, that's not it. And even scientists, many of whom are spiritually oriented, are formal religion, even they will generally admit that or say that the religious point of view is subjective and irrelevant to determining scientific truth. They call it an artifact of civilization, was one of the comments that I came across. So it puts in perspective what's viewed as important and what is not. Now, in the 20th century, quantum theory began eroding this idea that the scientifically provable information is what's true. It's beginning to creep into some of our understanding, but let's face it, quantum theory is not the most easy thing to understand, especially if you're not a scientist. Nonetheless, the worldwide assumption still remains that science is the gold standard for determining truth. And also, it remains that physical reality is what is perceived by the five senses. And the name that this has been called is radical materialism. This is the culture in which we live. And again, it doesn't mean that religion and spirituality doesn't exist, but the dominant culture is that of radical materialism. If you see it, and it can be scientifically verified, it's true, and the other is there, but floating somewhere, we're not quite sure what. We'll talk about questions afterwards. So, there is now, past few years, new scientific evidence that shows that reality is more than what our senses perceive. And this new evidence really shows the light between science and spirituality. It's making scientific connections. It's not, as I said, it's not quantum theory, it's something else. I'm going to discuss it. Several scientists have been working on it. And tonight I want to focus specifically on the work of a woman. She's a professor and scientist at the Columbia University. Her name is Lisa Miller. She is a pioneer in the area of science and spirituality. And her specific focus has been on mental health and spirituality. So, by the way, when she uses the word spirituality, we can understand that the contemplative path is part of spirituality. I think that's understood. The links to her work, and there are two things, a podcast, a 2-hour podcast, almost 2 hours, and a book that she wrote called The Awakened Brain. Brianna will be putting those into chat later. not right now. And they were up on the web, and they will also be up on our website on the archives if you're interested. And I'll say it's really worthwhile reading her things. Okay, her work began in the 90s. She began inquiring into the impact of spirituality on depression. And what she wanted to do was to learn more about preventing depression. And believe me, in the 90s, this was really controversial. Spirituality was not considered a fit topic for scientific research. So it was really interesting. So in the early 90s, she and colleagues did many studies. They're epidemiological. That is, they were studies that were interviews with a variety of different populations talking about spirituality and kind of figuring out the impact on people. In the 20 teens, she points out that the quality of the MRIs increased in the early 20 teens, and the cost decreased, which made MRIs available to Lisa Miller and her team. And now they have over 10 years worth of MRI studies of the brain. And the focus that they were studying was the impact of spirituality on the brain. So I want to talk about and summarize some of her major findings. And the first finding is that spirituality isn't simply a belief. It's not something that a few weird individuals like us go in for. It's hardwired in us. The MRI studies showed that 1/3 of the brain governs our spiritual capability. In other words, we are born with a capability and capacity for spirituality. We are spiritual beings. That it's innate within us, spirituality. It's like a gravitational pull, and I know many of us know exactly what that means, like a gravitational pull. We're just pulled toward it. It's a gravitational pull. And again, something contemplatives have known forever. And the meditation I led this evening was trying to get us into that general area of the gravitational pull and to show that it isn't reliant upon our senses. 1/3 of the brain governs the capacity for spirituality. 2/3 of the brain, and that's hardwired, 2/3 of the brain are socialized. That is, if we decide and go and become engaged in any spiritual endeavor, the 2/3 of the brain have said it's okay to do that. Our environment is such that kind of either supports it or it doesn't support it, and we're going to do it anyway, but it is socialized. Let me say that again. 1/3 of the brain is hardwired in us, and it governs this capacity for spirituality. 2/3 are open for decision. Some people do, some people don't. And what Lisa Miller and her team found out is that those people who generally get involved pulled by spirituality are those people who have a strong sense of devotion or curiosity or conviction that there is something greater than ourselves, something greater than what our senses provide, that we're pulled by something else, and call it, again, God or divine mystery or whatever, but there's a pull, and it isn't because we see it necessarily, although it can be triggered by what we see, because let's face it, you see nature, and we love it, and we know there's something in it that is deeply meaningful. It's beyond just the farm, but it's deeply meaningful. So overall, it's this sense of being pulled by something that is beyond us and profoundly meaningful. So those are the people, the science research found out, that are mainly drawn to spirituality. On the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are engaged, and maybe very seriously engaged in formal religion. And she said a major distinction for many of them is that they tend to be personally conservative. They tend to want to do it like it has always been done. And many of them, of this group, simply are on automatic. They do it because their families have done it, because they received it as a child or whatever, and they attend church or they do whatever they do, but it's because that's been given to them to do. And now let me say, there are many people involved in formal religion, we know, who are in it, and it is spiritual for them as well. It is an inquiry, a deep belief in something bigger, but that is the spiritual component of formal religion. I would love tonight to talk about that. Maybe next time. I started out writing this in a big section on that, and there's no time right now to do that. So I'm just going on, and I'm not criticizing formal religion. And I think we all know that how many people are profoundly spiritual who are involved in it. But there are also many in spirituality who are doing it because, this is what our family has always done. And we've got our family church and our pew or whatever we have, our synagogue, our mosque or whatever. If you're in spirituality and that is a contemplative path like this, you're not here because your family has always done, at least if you're a Westerner, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear. Then, of course, there are people these days who choose to do none of it. And again, we can very likely they're just not pulled at all by this sense of something that is greater than we are. Okay, so that's one set of conclusions that her studies have reached. Another set that is really stunning is that the MRI studies have shown that the physical brain looks different when there's been a breakthrough in awareness. When there has been a breakthrough in awareness of a greater reality, the brain looks different. The brain tissue in the areas that govern, I said the 1/3, they say 1/3, in those areas, the brain tissue is stronger and thicker, and there are more neural networks. I mean, it's just, they were stunned when they first found this out. So neuromarkers in the brain, they distinguish it between those who have had a breakthrough in spirituality and really know, and those who haven't. Moreover, some findings about spirituality and depression. Conventionally, depression is viewed as a pathology, something that want to get rid of, medicate away. But this research shows that depression, or a sense of emptiness, or question, what's the meaning of it all, it can be a hopeful sign. A hopeful sign because it can signify spiritual hunger. There's just a spiritual yearning that our culture does not satisfy. Why? Because it's radical materialism prevails. So what Lisa Miller has pointed out, she said that we should not, when there is when there's depression or emptiness that has been triggered or generated because of the spiritual hunger, it's a mistake to try to medicate it away. It's a mistake to view it as pathology. In fact, she said, it is a normal feature in human development, at least here in the West, especially here in the West. She didn't add the here in the West, but we know that, I think. It shouldn't be medicated away. It should be understood as a possible precursor to spiritual awakening. And then she pointed out that, and I think many of us know this, that spiritual awakening is also often preceded by a conflict of some sort. Often there's a real struggle, and it might be internal, like depression, or it might be something external, like loss of a job or a loved one or some big crisis. but often a spiritual awakening occurs as a result of that. So depression is part of it. They also discovered that when people feel there's something greater, when they feel loved and held by a greater force in the universe, then the path to recovery, if they've experienced depression, is different neurologically, not only externally, but neurologically, than when they feel that the world is a hostile place. There's a different path to recovery. And then a person who has gone through this awakening is less likely to experience depression afterwards than a person who hasn't. In fact, she really stressed that. She called spiritual awakening a buffer, a shield, and protection against recurrence of depression. I mean, she's really strong on that. Now, I don't know, some of you might find out who feel you've had some kind of awakening experience that every once in a while can get pretty depressing, but it isn't, I mean, the world, or you, but this is really strong evidence that there's been a change, a real change afterwards, and how you relate to life. And I think we know what that change is. You're no longer just about coming from the ego. You see it in a different way. You understand life in a different way with a different relationship to it. She also found out, or the research also found out, that spiritual people are less likely to become addicted to substances. Less likely. So those are, I think, the major results. And what I thought I'd like to do is talk about briefly some of the implications of these findings. And I mean really briefly, because I like us to have a chance to talk. And that is, first of all, it's clear that spirituality isn't just a thought. No, it's not just an aspiration. It is fundamental. It is talking about or referring to or being pulled by a universal reality, a oneness. It is meaning, the feel of it is shared being, that we are part of this universe. And we share it. We're not just a special part sitting on top outside and looking at it. We share our being. So, another implication. There's been a major shift in perception of human beings is underway, a huge shift, as big as the shift between, remember, flat Earth, people thought we were going to fall off the side of the Earth. And then we realized, oh no, wait, it's round. I mean, we've always known it's round. I mean, there are individuals who've always known that the Earth is a globe, but it was not accepted. It was understood as flat by Europeans anyway. As big as that, or as big as that idea that, remember, that humans used to think that the cosmos revolved around the Earth. And it was radical, and I know that there's stories about who was. Let's not get into it. It was recognized, no, the Earth is just one planet revolving around the sun. I mean, that put us as human beings in an entirely different place. And I mean, it was outrageous to the common sensibility at the time. Okay, so here goes another one that's underway now. 20th century view was radical materialism. If it was science, and if it could be defined by science and subjected to science, then it was right. And if it's spiritual, somewhere out in the wings floating over there, but we don't pay too much attention. A cultural artifact. But with quantum theory, which many of us don't understand, but I think we can get an implication from it, and with research like this and the MRI studies, it becomes really clear something else is fundamental. It isn't just what we see, that in fact what we see and hear and our senses pick up isn't primary. What's primary is, let's call it consciousness, or call it a divine being, or call it whatever you want. That's what's primary, and our senses see it according to their abilities and capabilities. A dragonfly sees things very different from the human being. And our articulated assumption is, oh, well, we've got the right one and they're just lower beings. But no, it is our senses that determine what we see and how we see it, the human understanding of faculties. So right now, what is being challenged is that no, the fundamental reality is not what science shows, and it isn't what we pick up in with our senses, although that's not to discard it. It's just to say there's a different set of relationships, a different importance. It's secondary. What's primary is consciousness and the fact that we are expressions of it, and our senses are expressions of consciousness. So that is the 21st century view. This is what is coming more and more, is probably going to come into being the dominant view. And I think all of us still have that. We're children of the 20th century, right? And I think even the young ones are still children of are children of the 20th century. And you've got this view of science and matter, physical reality. This is shifting. It is shifting. So one implication of that, all we have to do is look around the world and see the ravages that the view of separation, because the 20th century view, radical materialism, asserts separation, individualism, right? It's coming from an I, where there are all these eyes running around. We've all got different eyes. We all have different interests, and all we have to do is take one look at one newspaper, front page today, and we know what the problems are. It's tragic. What is coming into being is going to be conducive to a more loving world. When people begin deeply to recognize that we are all one, as societies, individual civilizations have in the past, by the way, indigenous civilizations and others, if we as a world culture begin to realize it, it will mean likely a more loving world. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody's going to sit down around and sing Kumbaya or anything like that, but it will be a shift in which we realize we're all part of each other in a deep way. How it'll play out, nobody knows, but there's some shift underway. One further thing, she talks about synchronicity and mystical experiences. No longer is the scientific methodology simply the only guarantee for truth. And she talks about so many wonderful synchronous events that she experienced, but she points out that a major portion of the scientists that she studied or know of who had major breakthroughs, those breakthroughs were preceded by some act of synchronicity or a mystical experience. It wasn't just the scientific experiment or whatever created the breakthrough came after that. In other words, they didn't dismiss the synchronicity. As she said, there's a great quote. She said, "Our suffering comes from ignoring the divine imperative." The synchronicity is a divine imperative. It's the world talking to us. It's consciousness, the divine talking to us. Don't dismiss it. Oh, well, that's just, coincidence. It's just, no, this is the world talking to us. And she said, listen to it. Let's face it, this calls for courage. There's courage that's involved in this path because it can be terrifying. It can mean huge changes become clear that you need to make, and some of us know exactly what that means. And it's not for someone who is utterly risk averse. If you're gonna, whoops, I don't think I want to do that. It's not for you, We each make our own decisions of what's right, but this point about the courage, nobody knows but you yourself for you. Do you say yes, or you say, I don't think so? Everybody's different. One more thing,
I just have a feeling we need chapter 2. Can you do that?
We'll talk about that. Thank you, everybody. It is now 7:31, and thank you so much for being here and for your conversations. Yeah, yeah.